government out of the education business. You get that money back into the pockets of parents, and you tie it to the children. And when you do that, you create competition, because when school districts now have to vie through school choice, like Arizona has done, we're one of the most pro-school choice states in the country, you create that competition. When schools compete for those dollars, and they don't have to worry about getting it from some bureaucrat, and they actually have to be accountable to the parents for performing, you will see a huge change in the dynamic in education. So yes, I would support bringing money back home.
Thank you, Mr. Engineer. Mr. Kelly, your rebuttal, please.
The best way to increase our education funding is to stop having to send it back to a Washington, D.C. filter, where we send $1 back, they filter it out, we pay the unelected bureaucrats, and then we get 70 cents back with 70,000 different ways on how we're supposed to spend our money. The best way is to keep that money in the state, never send it back to wasteful Washington, and keep it right here. So parents, once again, can control education.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly.
Thank you. My final question on the topic of education is for Mr. Sitton. Mr. Sitton, what legislation would you support to alleviate rising college tuition costs?
Goes back to competition, and also that states will compete with each other for competition. When the University of Arizona, Arizona State University, or Northern Arizona University are in the business of competing against other schools around the country, as they have been, they will keep their tuition rates lowest. And they've also got to start paying attention to what it costs to educate each and every one of our students. There can be no waste, and as a result, when we get our budgets in line and have states competing against each other, as they do, and as you know in this country, there's a lot of opportunity to go to different level of colleges, whether it be private or publicly supported. I think competition amongst the colleges, real competition, will keep tuition in line.
Thank you, Mr. Sitton. Mr. Antonori.
Again, that's a state issue and a local issue, and every time the federal government increases the student loan or grant amounts, the universities immediately jack up the tuition to match. There's a direct correlation between the expansion of loans and grants and the increase in college tuition. So obviously, that solution is the wrong answer. It's not working. You have to go back to the local level, encourage competition, and work towards finding private ways to fund education for our kids that want to go to college.
Thank you, Mr. Antonori. Mr. Kelly.
Well, it's already been said that students and universities should be competing with each other. Competition is the one thing out there that those of us who believe in the free market realize it makes us uncomfortable, but it makes us all better. Universities should be fighting for students, to get students in. Students shouldn't have to spend most of their lives after college trying to pay off these burdensome college loans.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Ms. McSally, your rebuttal.
Yes, sure. As a conservative, the federal government needs to be doing less legislation, not more legislation when it comes to these local issues. So I would propose no legislation in order to address these rising costs, but we would stop having federal loans that are piling up that then raise the cost of tuition, surprisingly. So what we need to do is make sure we've got the best education in the world, we've got good competition amongst those colleges, students get to pick, and they're able to compete for their dollar that they're spending on their college education and get the federal government out of the way.
Thank you, Ms. McSally, and thank you, Ms. Timmons. Mr. Daniel Shumley, will you please ask your first question?
Thank you, Mr. Vina. My questions will cover immigration. Mr. Antonori, how do you plan to strengthen border security?
Well, that's a two-pronged approach. First, we have to provide enough security and manpower and infrastructure on the border to secure it. We do that by following the 18-point plan done by the Arizona cattlemen in honor of slain rancher Rob Prince. They call it the Rob Plan, Restore Our Border Plan. It's a great plan. It includes building fencing along the border where you can build it, putting sensors in where you can't build a fence, putting 3,000 more Border Patrol agents out there, putting National Guard on the border until that infrastructure is built, and then having an enforcement mechanism where we can discourage people from coming here illegally in the first place, because they know if they are able to make it across the border, they will eventually get caught and returned to their country of origin. You have to enforce the law. The 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act was passed into law for a reason. Unfortunately, the federal government hasn't enforced it. But we have here in Arizona, and that's why we passed SB 1070, a bill that I voted for and supported, and that has done a lot to curb illegal immigration in Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Antonori. Mr. Kelly, your rebuttal.
Build a double-layer border fence. They built it in San Diego, and violent crime dropped by 50%. We can do it. It's already the law. We simply need to build it. Also, give our Border Patrol agents the resources and manpower they need. I have several good friends on the Border Patrol. They have to buy their own AA batteries for their radios several times. We're competing with billion-dollar cartels, and our people have to buy their own Duracells. I don't think that's correct.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Ms. McSally?
This is a complex issue that can't be answered in 30 seconds, but a fence is not going to do it. What we need is a combination of barriers, fences, manpower at the border, which is on the front line, the technologies that we have in sensors, radars, sonars, plus airborne assets in order to actually interdict, track, and intercept the transnational criminal organizations. I've planned and led operations like this, joint ground and air operations in other parts of the world. We need the political will at the federal level in order to address this threat and solve it, and that's the main problem. We know how to do it, we're just not doing it.
Thank you, Ms. McSally. Mr. Sitton?
We need to take the demagoguery out of this issue by taking the immigration issue and addressing it as soon as humanly possible. Meanwhile, the border, having been down there much of the last 2 months and spending a lot of time with the people who live in that part of the world, there is places for fencing in the urban areas, the eco-post and rail fencing, which is a modest security measure allowing wildlife and water to go between the two countries, and finally using the sensors. One thing we do know about fixed fortifications in the history of the world, all of them have been breached. We need to have air patrols up and down the border and deploy our services.
Thank you, Mr. Sitton.
All right, my next question is for you, Mr. Kelly. Would you support reducing foreign aid for countries we receive illegal immigrants from?
Yes. Currently, foreign aid is 2% of the budget, so it is not the only thing that is bankrupting us, but we give foreign aid to countries who we don't care for, that they don't care for us. It is not the job of the American taxpayer to be writing blank checks to these other nations, not when we're in debt, not when we need tax cuts, not when we need jobs. We can start keeping American money in America.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Ms. McSally?
We live in a dangerous world right now, and we've got threats emanating from places like Iran and the Middle East and in Asia and south of us. We need to be smart about engaging those threats that are in our national interest, which includes a whole-of-government approach, security assistance, diplomacy, economic, and sometimes that's foreign aid. We need to enforce the laws on the books in order to stop illegal immigration, and we need to be smart about engaging to defend our national interest.
Thank you, Ms. McSally. Mr. Sitton?
One, we need to control our border. It's our responsibility. We don't want to be involved in the world of reliance. It's the legal term that we've used by not having an enforceable border. Second thing, when it comes to foreign aid, again, it is a minor part of our program, but if we were to provide it, I would say in services and in kind, no more cash to any of the countries, particularly those where we are having an immigration issue.
Thank you, Mr. Sitton. Mr. Antonori?
Yeah, we should definitely reduce foreign aid to any country that doesn't support us and our principles. We should definitely not give money to our enemies, which we currently still do, which is surprising to me. Only our staunchest allies should receive foreign aid, and only if it's in our best interests. And if they fail to live up to those interests, they shouldn't receive a penny from the taxpayers of this country.
Thank you, Mr. Antonori.
Ms. McSally, would you support any type of legislation that mirrors the DREAM Act?
Absolutely not. I mean, again, teaching at the Marshall Center, we're teaching countries that are coming out of conflict and transition to democracy. We tell them rule of law is the foundation of a democracy. I mean, it's the very skeleton upon which you build. We are the beacon of light for democracy around the world, and rule of law is the foundation there. So we have got to uphold the rule of law. We have got to make sure that if crimes have been committed, people are not, breaking our laws, that we don't have any sort of amnesty. So the DREAM Act is not the way to go. We've got people standing in line in order to get into college, like many of you, and we have people standing in line to serve in our military, and we need to make sure that those opportunities are available to them to serve and get a good education as American citizens.
Thank you, Ms. McSally. Mr. Sitton?
I would not support the DREAM Act for the very same reason that Martha just enunciated. There is no way to reward people breaking the law. We do have to have a different look at immigration, though, find out what it is we want in America in the way of labor, and what we are going to do to the undocumented folks that are in this country right now. Are we going to provide them a special status after they plead to what they've done is breaking the entering of the United States of America? If they want to become citizens, they leave the country, tag up, and come back in. There are people waiting in line to become American citizens. That cannot be disrespected.
Thank you, Mr. Sitton. Mr. Antonori?
No.
Mr. Kelly?
No, I fought side by side with some brave men in the Marine Corps who were fighting, trying to become citizens of this nation. We're not going to let that happen.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly.
My final question is a current event question for you, Mr. Sitton. Would you support a national drug testing standard for welfare recipients?
This is a long time in coming. I think it's time to start talking about